Hello and welcome back to the show. We are back for episode 2. In the first episode, I started telling you my story. I called it the failure story part 1, and I fully intend to pick up where I left off and continue that story today. But first, I'm going to confess something to you. I'm going to try and be honest on this show. That's important to me. And I hope that you are honest with me as well and let me know what you think, the good and the bad and the ugly and the beautiful. I have a confession, and the confession is I have a dream. One day I will be getting my hair cut at a barbershop or a salon or a Great Cuts or something along those lines, and the barber, who in my dream is a man, will ask me what I do for a living, and I will say I'm a writer. And that's a dream. I don't know why this particular dream takes place in a barbershop or why I'm always getting my hair cut or why it has to be there. There's a lot of other places where it could take place, I suppose, but it's always there. And when did I first have that dream? I feel like I first had that dream when after I read On the Road when I was, 20, 19. And when you're 19 or 20, that's a good time to read On the Road. Don't read On the Road when you're 40, 50. You'll just think, man, those kids are fucking irresponsible. But when you're young and you are free and full of ideas and you got all kinds of motivation, then it's a good time to read On the Road. It'll motivate you to move. But that was the first time where I think probably the first time where I'd ever heard a writer talk about sort of being a writer or being, I guess it romanticizes the life of a writer, really, even though it doesn't romanticize it, because Kerouac talks about how hard it is on the road and how poor he is and how sad he is, and but it romanticizes the writer's life in the sense that it talks about the writer's life, and it seems fun when you read it. You think you want to have adventures. At least I did. Maybe that was the first time that I had that dream about the barbershop, but I really wanted to. I want, and I still do want to get to that point where if someone asks me, what do you do for a living? I can say that I'm a writer, and that always has made me happy. I don't know why. I'm going to tell you another confession while we're at it. No, this isn't really a confession. This is just a memory. But I was traveling in Europe when I was in college doing an overseas program, and I was on a train from some country to another some country, and this guy sat down next to me, this older gentleman. Again, I was in my 20s, so I don't know how. Maybe he was in his 60s or something. That was pretty old to me at the time. And somehow we started chatting. He must have initiated it, because I wouldn't have just initiated small talk with a stranger. That's not something, especially when I was younger, I was too shy to do that sort of thing. And he told me that he was a travel writer, and he was going to this new town. I think we're in Italy somewhere, and he was going to some obscure town in central Italy where he was going to research the culture and eat the food and meet the locals and stay there for a while and write about it and report back to, I guess it was a magazine that he was writing for. There were no podcasts back then. There weren't even really any blogs back then. Well, no, there were blogs back then. The internet was young. I believe he was writing for a magazine. Anyways, I remember looking at that guy and talking to that guy, and it was the first time in my life where I thought, man, I want that guy's job. I had never thought that before. Uh, and of course, it's a little naive because I think his job is hard. And now that I'm older, I can think, well, shit, that would be a lonely job. You can't have a family, or if you do, you're away from your family all the time. And, I'm sure that it's fun at first. And then after a while, all that travel would wear on you and you're just a stranger all the time and you don't have any sort of habits or routines and you're eating junk food and you're on trains and planes. I don't know. Everybody's different. Some people like that sort of lifestyle and some people can handle it and some can't. I would think about it differently now is all I'm saying. But, and this guy was in his 60s, so that's amazing that he was doing that. Who knows? Maybe he hated his job. I don't know, but he seemed nice and not nice. He seemed content. He seemed peaceful. He was nice to me, anyways. But I do remember that it was the first time I ever thought I was envious of his situation, and I never thought that with any other adult. Yeah. I never thought, yeah, like I would love to do that. That's what I want. But I didn't act on it, and I just kept going to school because I don't know why. Because that's what people do. I didn't know how to start being a travel writer, and I didn't look into it. So there you go. That's a confession and a memory right off the jump. We're rolling. Uh, okay, I'm gonna tell you this. I need to tell you this last strange tidbit, and then I'll get on with the show. I need to tell you this just because it's been on my mind. I haven't told anybody about it yet. But when I woke up this morning, I had this very strange. It felt like a epiphany. Now it doesn't feel like an epiphany, but when you wake up and you're still half dreaming, and I was dreaming about evolution. I was dreaming about sleep. I can't remember anything about the dream, but when I woke up, I was thinking, how crazy is it that humans evolved to sleep for roughly 8 hours a night, not because that was the optimal time that the human body needed. I mean, it ended up being the optimal time that the human body needed, but we evolved that way because we're on Earth, and because of the way that the Earth rotates around the sun, that's approximately how many hours of dark we get. So there was a really fascinating guest on the Joe Rogan podcast that I listened to maybe last year, this neuroscientist who specializes in the science of sleep. And he was talking about how your body responds to temperature and light, and not just one of those things, but all of those things, and how important sleep is. Now I'm feeling a little dumb because I'm not even sure what was so epiphanous about this thought, but it just struck me as amazing that, like, what if humans had evolved on a different planet that had a different rotation? I don't know how long days are on Jupiter, but isn't it something crazy like a day? Days on other planets can be any kind of crazy amount, like maybe 72 hours is a full day. And so, like, what if we evolved on one of those planets? Would we sleep? Would we naturally be able to stay awake for 72 hours before then needing to sleep for 72 hours? That would be nuts if we slept for 3 days. But I mean, that's not that much weirder than sleeping for one day and then being awake for 14 hours and then sleeping for 10 hours. I mean, that's pretty crazy. I don't know. Sleep is weird. What happens when you sleep? Nobody knows, except for this neuroscientist that came on the Joe Rogan podcast. He knew what happens, but he can explain it better than I can. obviously. Let's move on. I do want to get into the story of my writing journey, but first, I had a couple other things on my list that I wanted to get to, but I got a little sidetracked at the beginning of the episode, confessing all of my dreams and memories. So I think I'm going to skip those and I'm going to jump back into the failure story part two. Now, before I jump into this, let me just say that I hope it's interesting and insightful for you to hear this story. I'm calling it a failure story because, well, a lot of ways it is a failure story, uh, but I'm trying to turn it into a success story. I talked about that last time. I hope that you enjoy hearing this, and I went back and forth for a long time whether to even go into it or not because I just felt like, oh, it's boring. Nobody wants to hear, and it's not exciting because I didn't win. I didn't. It's not a oh, here's it'd be much easier to write the blog post like here's all the troubles I had, but then I wrote a bestseller and now I'm an author. That would have been a uh, much easier and more delightful sort of way to start the podcast. But I've wanted to start a podcast for a long time, and a year or so ago when I was living in Australia, I got everything. I got the mic out. I got wrote all these notes. I had all these plans, and then I just sort of got overwhelmed by it. And one of the main reasons why I haven't told this whole story about my writing, I hate saying right. I feel cheesy when I say writing journey, writing path, writing history, writing adventure. One of the reasons I haven't told it is because I just feel like I'm like groveling and sort of being self-indulgent. But I got inspired, or I felt better about it after I heard Gary Vee talking. For those of you who know who Gary Vee is, he's good for a kick in the ass, especially if you follow him on Twitter or Instagram. I think I was watching a Gary Vee YouTube video, and he said a bunch of words in a row, which were things that I intellectually knew or things that I could have said, oh, yes, I agree with that. But, sometimes you hear things at the right time of day or the right season in your life, and it hits you harder. And I was thinking about this podcast, and it was all on my mind already. But he was saying just not to be embarrassed by your failures, and to instead of feeling like nobody wants to hear, or man, I feel ashamed, and just bearing it all, that instead you should lean into it and be honest about it, and that will resonate with people because everyone has their own failures and struggles, and so they can relate to that. And so I'm just telling you this so that you know that I've struggled in the past whether to even go into all this with what I've done with my writing, and I'm finally doing it, and it feels good for me just to get it all out. But I really hope it's really exciting for me if this turns out to be a success story, and I do publish my novels, and I can support my family with my writing. Then you can pat me on the back, and I'll be happy, and everybody's happy, and then I'll have this record. I'm a big fan of documenting. I love keeping pictures. I love keeping, especially writing. That's always been one of the weird, egotistical, or maybe not weird, but just that's always been a primal part or an important part of why I wrote. I think even when I was young, it's just because I like to record stuff. I don't like the idea that I'll forget stuff and one day everything will be forgotten. I guess I'm just talking about the whole, immortality conundrum, that one day we're going to all die, and nothing's going to matter anymore. Wow. Maybe I'm getting tired or something. Fuck. So last time, I think where I left off is that I had finished NaNoWriMo, and I talked about Hugh Howey, and I was writing short stories. And now if you go to jacksontandy.com and you look at the writing section, you can see on there the Mr. Green story, which I wrote a few years ago. I put that up on my website so you can see. I guess I just feel like it's more real if I put things online, bits of writing I've done, if I put it online so that you can see I'm not totally full of shit, but these are the things that I was writing at the time and what I was going through, and I plan to do more of that. And so I remember that I wrote all these short stories, and I think it was coming up on my 30th birthday, another one of those times where I was thinking, holy shit, what am I doing? And I had written all these stories, but I thought, man, I just need to start this novel. I think I was sort of waiting for some great inspiration, some sort of vision to come to me, some grand idea so I could start the novel. And that never happened. And so I just forced it one day, and I said, all right, I gotta write this novel, or else it's never gonna happen. So when I started, I had this concept for a novel series called Turtle Island, and I always just thought that I would write epic fantasy. One of the first books I read that I loved was The Hobbit. I read the Redwall series when I was young, which are, young adult or kids fantasies with animals, but they are fantasies in the sense that, castles, swords, good and evil battles, that kind of thing. Yeah, I especially liked sci-fi. I read a lot of Orson Scott Card when I was young, read a lot of Michael Crichton, read J.R. Tolkien, read Stephen King. I don't know, what other fantasies did I read? When I set out to write my novel, I imagined that it would be an epic fantasy trilogy, because that's sort of self-publishing 101, is if you're going to write one, you might as well write a trilogy. And it's much harder to sell a one-off novel, and it's much easier to sell trilogies and even longer series. If people like your series, then they'll buy the next book and the next book and the next book, hopefully. Then you can sell box sets. If you're self-published, box sets are a good money-making strategy. So I thought, all right, I'm going to write an epic fantasy. I'm going to do this thing. I just got to start writing. It's do or die, now or never. And I don't know when or where exactly why, but I had this idea of a young boy in an overturned turtle shell, like a giant turtle shell, the size of a boat. The turtle shell is upside down. It's in the water like a boat, and the boy is kind of standing up at the bow, and he's got one leg up like a captain or an explorer, and the wind's blowing through his hair, and he's cutting through the ocean in this turtle shell. And I don't know why, but I loved that image, and I wanted that to be the cover of the book. And so I set out and I started writing this novel, which I called Turtle Island. It was fall of 2015, maybe close to winter of 2015, when I started writing this novel, Turtle Island, and I wrote every day. I tried to write 1,000. I think I started out trying to write 2,000 words a day. That was too hard at first. I choked it back down to 500 or 1,000 every day. Whatever it was, I was putting out words every day, and I was writing this novel, and I was excited about it, and I just got lost, man. I just started drowning the way that all young novelists do. And by young, I mean young writers, not young people. And it was difficult. It was a great learning experience. And just to try and take a character from beginning to end, not to mention a cast of characters, I was going all out epic fantasy. I had a world. I had many different cultures. I had a map. I had different towns, different villages. I had this whole bit. I did all kinds of world building and researching about the environment and the cultures and languages. I didn't invent any languages, but I did invent different kinds of people and different kinds of creatures and different cultures, and thought about all of their history and the way the world all fit together. And I wrote that story over the winter and then on into 2016. And I think I wrote 100,000 words. That was my estimate. But I just never could really get to the ending. I wrote this big beast of a story and I couldn't ever really wrap it up cleanly. And that's just because, looking back now, it's obvious that I was unfocused. When I started the story, I didn't know how the story was going to end. And that was a revelation that I had a year later or much later, is that to write a good story, well, this is debatable depending on which writer you ask, but especially for a new author who doesn't have full trust in his or her own capabilities, it's really difficult to write a story if you don't know where it's going. You're just going to end up wandering around like taking a road trip or going on a hike if you don't know where your final destination is. There's a good chance that you're going to get lost, and I got lost as I was writing that novel. But I loved my characters. I was having fun writing it, and had this whole big sprawling manuscript. And so the big step that I made in 2016 was I hired a professional editor. That was the first time I had ever done anything like that. I was nervous. I remember we were living in Alaska at the time, and I found this editor just through, I think it was through podcasts that I listened. I listened to this editor on a podcast, and I just liked, you know how when you listen to somebody speaking, you can kind of get a feel for, oh, me and that person would be friends, or I would enjoy hanging out with that person, or you get the opposite feeling, which is that that's not the kind of person I want to be around. Well, I listened to this editor on a podcast, and I liked her. I liked all the things she was saying. So I did all my research. I applied. I sent her a 10-page sample, and she sent it back just full of criticism, just more red than white on the paper. It wasn't actual paper, but you get the point. And she just tore it to shreds, and she told me all the things that I did wrong. And she said, you have some potential. She didn't say I had potential, but she said, you have some basic skills. I'd love to work with you. You need a lot of work, but your writing is good, more or less, is what she said. But she tore that 10-page sample to shreds, and I thought, hell yeah, this is what I need. I need tough love. I don't want some sort of friendly editor who's going to just coddle me or try to get my money. I want somebody who's going to kick my ass. I want to bring out the best in me. So that was exciting. I think I had about 100,000 words at that time, but I just hadn't really wrapped up the ending. And but I went ahead and hired her anyway because I had momentum. I wanted to keep the ball rolling and not quit. And I remember we were living in Alaska at the time, and we were living in this cabin up the river, and there wasn't internet really. There was one landline, and so I had to have a couple hours free to Skype with the editor, and so I went into town. Normally I would take a float plane to get back to town. So it was like my vacation day, a couple days a month. I would go back into town and buy groceries or whatever, go see a movie or whatever, get on the internet, eat at a restaurant. And so I had this plan to go into town so that I could go to a coffee shop and Skype with this editor, and I was all pumped up and I didn't want to be late. And then the thing that happened was the weather sucked that day, and no planes could get in and out of the lodge. And sort of on a whim, at the last second, my wife and we got on a boat. So we were flying down the river in this fisherman's boat and just like sitting on the cooler getting water sprayed in our face, and it was freezing cold, and we were wearing those big jumpsuits, those big full body suits that they wear, like life vests slash body warmer suits. I forget what they're called. Anyways, had this fun but untimely adventure to get down, take a boat all the way down the river into town. And then when we did get there, the dock was on the wrong side of town. And so we ended up wandering around and hitching a ride. Anyway, just at the last minute, I got into a coffee shop and got pulled up my computer screen, and I Skyped with my editor, and she had no idea what I had just got. I had salt in my hair, and I was all out of breath. And she just opened up the Skype call started, and she was just looking calm and sitting in her house and very ready and composed. And I'm sure I was frazzled and a mess. So I always remember that first meeting with my editor. And it was really scary to say, here's what I'm doing, here's what my novel is, here's what it's about. And I never, I told friends and family about what I was doing and about other stories I'd written in the past. But that was a really good process for me from start to finish. And what happened was the editor wanted me to write a storyboard. So this was something I had never done before, but she wanted me to write just a brief synopsis of each scene that was in my novel, and basically an outline. And I think she knew at that point that there were going to be big holes in the story, big problems with my characters. We weren't going to be talking about grammar. We weren't going to be talking about sentence structure or verb usage. We were going to be talking about big problems like character arcs and endings and villains and themes. And so I started working on the storyboard, and for the next few months I was working on it, and I learned so much through that process. One of the big mistakes I made was I tried to have this dramatic murder in the beginning of my story, and my editor called me out on that, and she said, well, this is really exciting and fascinating, this murder, but where are you going to go from here? Because nothing is going to be as exciting as this. And so she taught me about this idea of, or drilled into my head this idea of how, as the story progresses, the stakes need to be rising and rising until the climax, because the climax is the most critical and scary and amazing and wonderful thing that happens at the very end. But if you climax too soon, then no one wants to stick around for the rest of the story. So just basic things like that she was teaching me, while also critiquing some of my actual writing and actual things like sentence structure. And we talked a lot about just scenes and chapters and what makes a chapter, and inciting incidents and beginnings and middles and ends and tension. And I learned so much from her, and I was really paying, as much as looking back now, and I guess I sort of knew this at the time, but I was really paying more than just to have this shitty manuscript edited. I was paying for sort of a mentorship, or like a writing 101 class. And she is a professional, and she makes money editing and also writing her own stories. And so just to Skype with her, to talk with her, to email with her, all of that was really valuable. And every time I talked to her, I learned stuff. So we went through all these versions of this storyboard that I was writing, and I just, throughout that process, it became clear that I never had a good idea for what the ending of my story was going to be, and I never had a clear vision for my story. And she tried to work me through that, and it just got to the point I kept learning and learning and learning. So in that sense, it wasn't a failure, but it was a failure in the sense that by the time I finished working with her, I didn't have a good feeling that this manuscript could be finished. And so I felt strange about that. I felt bitter, like, hey, I hired you to help me get this novel to the point where I can publish it. And after we worked together for months, and at the end of it, I just didn't feel successful. By the time it was over, we had a storyboard, but there were still some big problems with the storyboard that I was trying to figure out about. There were still some big problems with my characters that I was trying to figure out. And, by the time it was over, it had been over a year that I had been working on this story. And I was just exhausted of it. I was tired of it. And I was honestly discouraged after working with a professional. And then by the end of that, she offered, I could have paid her a little more and kept working with her. But in the end, I made the really tough decision of just chalking it all up as a learning experience. And instead of spending another year trying to salvage that story that I had written, I felt like my time would be better used starting a new project. And that was a really shitty choice to make, because you want to finish your story and then you can move on. And so I didn't want to bail on this story because I knew that wasn't good, but it had been so long, and I had struggled so much with it, and then I just had lost all, over the course. That's a long ass time to work on one story over the course of a year. Every couple of weeks you go through those pitfalls and depressions where you don't want to work on it anymore, and you're bored with the characters, and then you find new motivation and you pick it up and you go back to the writing room and you keep going and keep persevering. And I just got to the point at the end of that where I guess the other part of it was feeling like I had bitten off more than I could chew. And my editor did help talk me through that a little bit. And she said, yeah, this is hard. You're not just writing a story about one character, but you have all this big supporting cast, and you have all these cultures and all this world building. And she didn't say that I couldn't handle it, but she did point out the challenges of bringing all these threads together, and helped me see why I was having so much trouble devising an ending to my sort of unfocused sprawl of a story. And so for that reason and the other reasons that I mentioned, I just felt like it was time to move on. And I was depressed about that. I felt really bad. For a while, I was angry at my editor for not helping me get this thing to the point where I could publish it. That was a really tough choice to make, and I still don't know whether I did the right thing or not. Maybe I should have pushed through and published that thing, and I would have been better off. Maybe I made the right choice by moving on and letting it die. Some things you gotta let die when it's their time. And I just chalked it all up as a learning experience and thought, okay, I can do better next time. And I did have much more success the next time. The next time I thought, all right, after that, it was like when you break up with your girlfriend or boyfriend, and then you want to just go the complete opposite direction in your next relationship because you're scarred by the previous one. When I started the next novel, I said, I'm going to do something simple here. I'm going to have this character and this side character, and then my character's going to have this problem, and then here's how he's going to fix the problem, and I'm just going to write this novella or short story, and I'm going to just keep it as simple as I can. I'm going to race to the end. And I had a lot more success with that, and I learned a lot more from that second novel. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. That one was called Jamie Ray Demon Hunter, but I'm gonna talk about that next time because that's a whole nother story. But let me wrap up this Turtle Island thread. So I'm gonna post this on my website. I'm not gonna post the whole thing, but I'm gonna post maybe an excerpt or the first chapter or part of the Turtle Island, which was my first real novel. I told you that I wrote that NaNoWriMo novel, but that wasn't even a story. That was just some autobiographical ramblings about young kids in Alaska. But this, I felt like I was proud of it. It was a fantasy novel, and I had made it. I had invented this world, and I had taken these characters through all these adventures. And it wasn't a good novel, but it, I did finish the storyboard, and I did write an ending to it. And it was 100,000 words of work. And the hopeful, optimistic side of me looks back on that and says, I've heard some writers say this thing where you have to write those million bad words before you can get to the good stuff. And you have to, all writers talk about how they have a few novels that are buried in their drawer that'll never see the light of day. And it's not just that you get unlucky and you write those shitty ones first. It's that you have to do those as stepping blocks to get to the better stuff, because each bad story that you write in the beginning gets you closer to the better stories that you can eventually write. So that's the optimistic side of me looking back on that experience now on the Turtle Island novel, working with that editor, all the things I learned from her, the things I learned I'm good at and not good at. I'm going to post I'm going to post an excerpt or a chapter or something of that Turtle Island novel on my website. But that takes us through 2016. That's what I was working on. And next time on A Failure Story Part 3, we're going to talk about Jamie Ray Demon Hunter, which was a better novel, still not a great one, but I kept learning in different ways. I think I'm going to call it good for now on episode 2. Honestly, really, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here and joining me on this trip. I hope you have a great night wherever you are in the universe. And before you go to bed tonight, just think about how fucking crazy it would be if you grew up on Saturn and the days were 100 hours long. Every day was 100 hours long. And I know this is totally off, whatever. I'm not a scientist. I don't care. I don't care at all what the actual days on Saturn are. This is just a thought exercise. What if the day was 100 hours long and you could go that long? You could just run full speed for 100 hours. Maybe you eat your 15 meals a day instead of 3 meals a day. Maybe you drink 21 liters of water instead of 3 liters of water a day. This math isn't correct. Again, I don't care. But just think how crazy that would be if you're awake for 100 hours. All the stuff you could get done. But then, you got to balance that shit out. So you got to sleep for at least 80 hours that night. How many times are you going to have to pee over the course of 80 hours? Just think about that. Just think about that.